Good morning, everyone. I'm glad that you could join us today for this briefing. It's been a momentous few months in Polish politics between the pandemic and the elections that were originally planned in May but are only being held now. This Sunday, Poles will go to the polls to choose between incumbent President Andrzej Duda, who's allied with the governing Law and Justice, or PiS, party, and Warsaw Mayor Rafał Trzaskowski, who is running with the opposition Civic Coalition. Whomever wins will have a lasting impact on the rule of law in Poland. The only question is, how lasting will that impact be? Our two experts here will help guide us through the elections and its implications for the rule of law. Barbara Grabowska-Moroz is a research fellow at the University of Groningen and associate with the RECONNECT project. Jakub Jaraczewski is a legal officer at Democracy Reporting International. Our work, my name is Hans Faber-Charbonneau. I'm communications coordinator with Democracy Reporting International. Our work on promoting the rule of law and democracy in Europe is part of the Reconstitution program, which is funded by Stiftung Mercator, a German foundation. I'll start the briefing with a few questions. Then we'll open up the floor to your questions. Simply write them in the dedicated section in the Zoom console, and we'll get to them after these first 4 or so questions. So let's start with the basics. Why is the Polish presidential election so important to the rule of law? Jakub, if you want to start.
Right. I think what we can begin with is to give you a little bit of a lowdown of who exactly the president of Poland is legally and politically. Because every time a Polish presidential election comes up, you can read all over the internet various attempts to compare the Polish president to the heads of the state and the government all over Europe and world. And you can read in some places that the Polish president is like the president of France, and Poland has a semi-presidential system. In other places you can read that the president of Poland is more like the president of Germany, a largely ceremonial figure. And it leaves you with a rather confused outlook on what exactly, who exactly the Polish president is. And this is not made in any way easier by the fact that the Polish setup is quite unique and doesn't lend itself well to comparison. So the Polish executive is composed of two bodies. There's the president and there's the prime minister. The president is elected by a popular vote, which is running right now. The prime minister is appointed by the parliamentary majority. And this, of course, immediately means that those two can come from different political groups or parties. And currently, we have President Duda, who used to be a member of the Law and Justice Party, and we have the Law and Justice Party running the government. But it has been in the past that the president would come from another political group than the government did. And we've been seeing across the recent Polish history various ways this did play out, depending on not only the political setup, but also personalities and ambitions of presidents in Poland. We've seen presidents cooperate with the governments coming from the same political group. We've seen presidents lock horns with governments coming from the same political group, as President Kwaśniewski, for example, used to do, despite the fact that the government would come from the same party as he did. So this is quite a unique setup. But unlike it is the case in France and several other countries, when you have the president and you have the prime minister, but the president is the more powerful one. He can dismiss the prime minister or he may dissolve the government. This is not exactly the case in Poland. So we have a rather unique setup. A popular vote, as any political science theorist or a constitutional law scholar will tell you, should mean a strong mandate, and that the Polish president should theoretically have a very powerful position owing to the fact that he is being elected by a popular vote by all citizens of Poland. And if you pull up the Polish constitution, you will first see a list of grand tasks set out for the Polish president. And then you will have a long list of competencies and powers which the Polish president enjoys. And at the first glance, it gives you an idea of a very powerful figure with immense influence on the country. But then there's the catch. For vast majority of his powers, the Polish president requires an approval from the prime minister, a written approval, contra signata, which is required for the president to exercise his powers. And this creates a rather unique landscape. in which the president can only employ a limited amount of his power without the approval from the prime minister, the government. But importantly for us today, it is the area of the rule of law where the president of Poland enjoys some powers which he can exercise without requiring an approval from the government. And I think this is the moment when I will turn over to Barbara to talk a little bit about what exactly are the powers of the Polish president in the area of the rule of law.
Thank you, Jakub. Well, I guess from the political perspective, when you have the government and the president coming from the same political party, the situation when one of the actor can change can in fact prove and give the evidence that this is the moment when checks and balances can really work in practice. Well, the president and his role in the rule of law protection is in fact crucial. However, it's not really obvious. As Jakub mentioned, most of the competences are provided by the constitution and given to the prime minister and the council of ministers, whereas the president, he has the last word when it comes, for instance, with the legislative process. So he may decide to sign the new statute, the new law. He might decide to veto the law or can refer the case to the Constitutional Tribunal. All those scenarios are extremely important when you look what has happened in Poland for last, what has been happening in Poland for last 4 years. This very accelerated legislative procedure can be in fact really stopped or at least slowed down if the president decides not to sign the law, or he really thinks 21 days that he is entitled to decide whether he wants to the draft become a law or not. But he can also in fact initiate legislative amendments if he decides to do so. We had one case, interesting from the rule of law perspective, when President Duda decided to draft a law on National Council of Judiciary and a law on Supreme Court, but in fact, those two drafts were very similar to the ones adopted by the government and by the parliament in July. So despite the fact that the president is not the one who enacts the law, his position is really important one when we think what kind of law will be the binding one in Poland. So if you, for instance, look at the judicial proceedings that are pending right now before the Court of Justice of the European Union, and you see that a couple of decisions were taken, such as interim measures, most of them were not addressed directly to the President of Poland, but indirectly he can also have influence and impact how those decisions will be implemented. For instance, because he is entitled to appoint judges. So if decision of the Court of Justice means you cannot appoint new judges to the Supreme Court because it violates the EU law, then it's quite a huge responsibility given to the president not to use his competence in light of interim measure and any other possible decisions from the Court of Justice. There's of course a number of other competences given by other statutory acts, but I guess these are the most important that really crucial right now when we think about rule of law issue and judiciary protection in Poland.
Thank you for that. Before we jump into the campaign and how the rule of law has featured, I was hoping, could you two maybe just explain some of the latest developments on the rule of law? This has been a long-standing story over the past 4 years, and maybe just give us an overview of the main points that have popped up in recent months. Barbara, if you want to go first.
If we start from one of our last meetings that took place in November last year, this was actually the moment that really quite a lot happened since that time. So we had this very important ruling in November 2019. The Court of Justice said that the Supreme Court is entitled to verify judges appointed by new Council of Judiciary, whether they were appointed lawfully or not. So this is really a new very important competence given to the Polish judges. and they were, in fact, not just taken out of the MON. It was supported by the EU law. So this is a really interesting situation, how the EU law impacts the power of the Polish courts. And the Supreme Court, what the Supreme Court did was to implement this decision twice, in December and in January. There was a huge resolution given by the three chambers of the Supreme Court, which in fact confirmed what the Court of Justice said. And the main conclusion was the judges are entitled to verify the legality of appointment, but also the so-called disciplinary chamber of the Supreme Court. It's not a court according to the Polish Constitution and according to the EU law in light of those decisions. And this decision was not, in fact, I mean, the government was not very happy about it, so they decided to introduce new law, so-called Mazu law, which introduced new procedures and also new restrictions on judges who would like to apply this kind of ruling. So undermining the legality or of appointment of a judge might become a disciplinary delict, that the judge can face disciplinary proceedings. And after that, the European Commission, in light of all of those situations, decided to apply for interim measure before the Court of Justice, but not directly in the case dealing with the Mazu law, but with the whole disciplinary proceedings case that was initiated in 2019 in April, but at that time it was already pending before the Court of Justice, and the Court of Justice decided to give this interim relief in April, deciding that the disciplinary chamber should not hear disciplinary cases against judges. However, how we see right now, they're working despite this interim measure. They have, for instance, decided the case of Judge Igor Tuleya. The idea is that according to the new first president of the Supreme Court, disciplinary chamber is, according to the interim measure, cannot hear the disciplinary cases, but can hear the cases dealing with the judicial immunity, and this was the case of Judge Tuleya. So also, meanwhile, we also had the shift in the position of the first president of the Supreme Court, Mrs. Gersdorf. Her term expired in April, and the new first president was appointed in May. She was elected by the judges, including those elected by the National Council of Judiciary, so new judges. But in the end, she was approved and appointed by the President of Poland, by President Duda. So this is again the moment when his powers are really crucial in this procedure.
Thank you. Jakub, if you would like to add to that.
So to sum it up all up, what we said so far, I would say that the biggest possible consequence that these presidential elections may have what's been happening for the rule of law in Poland is based around the power of the veto that the president may exercise and his potential ability to stop any primary legislation being enacted by the parliament. Now, that would not be the first time in the history of Poland when we would arrive at a setup where the president would be blocking the legislative initiatives of the government. We've seen that before. For example, when the late President Lech Kaczyński was faced with a government formed by his political opponent, the Civic Platform, he would effectively block the vast majority of the legislative initiatives. And the government would have then resorted to using secondary legislation and trying to creatively work around this veto. But for the purposes of what we've been seeing, how there is a possibility that in the case of Mr. Trzaskowski winning the presidency, he might be able to stop some of the legislative plans of the government and the ruling party, which they are continuing to bring up, and importantly, their reforms and changes to the judiciary. And I would say this would be probably the biggest, the most important president's competence from my point of view, and its implication on what could be happening down the road.
Thank you for the background. So now we're in the campaign. Has the rule of law shown up during the campaigning? Have the different parties taken clear positions on it? I know that the international press, people like us, are very interested in the rule of law, but has it actually come up in the day-to-day campaigning between the two main candidates?
All right, so so far we've been seeing Mr. Trzaskowski and Mr. Duda take the positions on the rule of law, which they've been insofar displaying as part of their broader political alignment. President Duda has continued to support the government and the ruling party, and with some small exceptions, he would not stand in the way of changes to the judiciary and to some of the most controversial initiatives. He would sign the bills into law. He would exercise his power of veto only on a single occasion. And basically, he is seen as an ally of the government and the ruling party, what they've been doing and so far with the rule of law in Poland. Mr. Trzaskowski, who represents the opposition party Civic Platform, is on the exact opposite. He is supporting the independence of judiciary. He is against the changes to the rule of law that's been happening in Poland over the course of the last 5 years. He promises to try to reverse those changes and to try to stand in the way of any further actions which he sees as deterioration of the rule of law, a backsliding. And that has been his position so far. But one thing that is important is that now that we are entering the second round with Trzaskowski and Duda, not only trying to reach out to their own voters, but also trying to reach across the aisle and try to catch some support from those candidates who participated in the first round but didn't make it to the second round. Their position on the rule of law and the views of their voters becomes quite important. And just to give you a quick rundown, the third best scoring candidate in the first round, Mr. Szymon Hołownia, an independent social conservative Catholic journalist and talk show host running on an independent platform, as well as Robert Biedroń representing the left and Mr. Kosiniak-Kamysz representing the Agrarian Party. As far as the rule of law goes, they've all taken positions similar to Mr. Trzaskowski, speaking up against the actions of the government and the backsliding and in favor of what they see as restoring a balance to the rule of law in Poland. Some of them have stressed this more. Mr. Biedroń was vocal about several areas of the rule of law, such as equality and non-discrimination. Mr. Hołownia has been speaking about judiciary, but those candidates have pretty much aligned on this. And it is expected that those voters of those candidates who were invested in the topic of the rule of law will likely support Trzaskowski. Now, the black horse of the second round and the group that will likely decide the outcome of the presidential elections are the people who have, in the first round, supported Mr. Krzysztof Bosak, representing Konfederacja, an alliance of far-right, nationalist, libertarian, and various fringe movements who have scored quite well in the last parliamentary elections and have entered a firm place in Polish politics. Though Mr. Bosak, as far as the rule of law goes, has had quite some interesting views. On the one hand, he was one of the few candidates who would propose some far-reaching reforms, which he touted as bringing the rule of law closer to the people. He, for example, spoke strongly about establishing, not dismantling the judiciary as he saw it being done by the ruling party, but instead reforming it to bring it closer to people, for example, by introducing magistrate courts, which would be staffed by lay judges and who would be closer to the actual people on the ground, or being very strongly in favor of the institution of referendum, which has been so far largely ignored by the government and the ruling party. But on the other hand, Mr. Bosak has also some quite controversial views, starting with pulling out of the European Union and discarding the Court of Justice of the European Union as mandate and trying to turn inward, let's say, as far as international cooperation of Poland goes. And those positions of Mr. Bosak has not been really addressed by neither of the candidates in the second round. Mr. Trzaskowski tried to reach out to the voters of Mr. Bosak by speaking about economic liberties, lowering taxes, and hitting the libertarian angle in a way, while Mr. Duda was, my President Duda is going for the nationalist sentiment and also stoking some of the anti-LGBT rhetoric that's been part of his part of the ruling parties referred to insofar, but not as strongly as is the case with Confederacja, which is openly against sexual minorities. So this is, let's say, the current landscape. Both leading candidates are trying to secure the hold on their usual voters, but also to reach out and try to have some support from the other candidates. Thanks.
Well, I think from the perspective of the rule of law, I think it was not definitely. I agree with Jakub about that. It was not the first, the main topic of the campaign. It was very blurred, and you cannot see any direct or precise statements about it. So, on the one hand, you can see what was the position of President Duda when the campaign even has not formally started. So his position on Mazel law was very supportive. He said that such law exists in different EU countries as France, and you have to have this kind of procedures that will discipline judges. I think you cannot see any similar positions by other candidates, especially with the second one, with Rafał Trzaskowski, who was not a candidate at the moment. So he was a kind of, his statements on rule of law started a little bit later, but one of his latest statements is that he's going to build a program to re-establish rule of law in Poland, but he didn't provide any kind of details how it will look like. He mentioned that experts are going to provide something like that. It just one small footnote, such ideas how to rebuild rule of law in Poland were taken place, and they were prepared already, for instance, by Batory Foundation in Poland. So the idea, what will be the one day after scenario, I think it's already done. But as you can see, the other topics that were covered by the campaign, and they were main topics, I think they can be really related to rule of law, and they can be affected, such as a very anti-LGBT narrative given by the President Duda. I think it's almost a kind of a hate speech when it comes what was the notion of his words and how he expressed himself. So I guess when you look from the perspective how the rule of law really works right now in Poland, what is the state of judicial independence, and when you see that if someone wants to be affected by such examples of hate speech, can you really have can you find effective legal protection before the Polish court if you have not fully independent judges, if their future career really depends on disciplinary advocate who was appointed by the Minister of Justice, who very often expressed himself also against judges as a kind of special elite, etc. So I think you can pick such elements from the campaign, and you see that the rule of law is really directly linked with those things.
Thank you for that. So before I ask my next question, I'll just remind participants that you can send us your questions through the Q&A button on the console, and then I'll put the questions to our panelists. Polls are voting on Sunday. We know that it's going to be one of these two candidates that win. What are the potential implications for the judiciary, and what could the EU do about it? Barbara, if you want to go first. You're muted at the moment.
Yeah, I just realized, sorry. Well, I think from the perspective of judiciary, from the internal point of view, I think that the crucial thing that is happening right now is, I think the process of building so-called chilling effect. So all the procedures that exist and have been used already by different bodies, I think it's really important to see and look how those disciplinary cases are going to be set up and established, and how they're going to be decided. I think this is really crucial for judges to feel that they are really independent. But from the EU perspective, I'm not really optimistic what will be done by the European Commission. They have already had numerous occasions to initiate different procedures, especially infringement procedures. And when we look, for instance, at muzzle law, which was adopted in January, we still in the pre-trial stage of the proceedings dealing with the infringement proceedings. So I don't think European Union is going to be taking steps quickly. I think they're going to work the way they did for last months. But I also think that there is a huge responsibility not only on the EU and the EU institutions, but also on other member states, other EU member states. Meaning, if they see that the rule of law is being violated in Poland, they have power, according to the treaty, to sue Poland and Polish government to the Court of Justice, arguing that they are violating some elements of the rule of law and also, for instance, secondary EU law. So far, no member state decided to exercise this power, but maybe this is the point that member states should also think. If President Duda remains in his office, I think he will not drastically change his position on rule of law and judiciary judicial independence. So I guess this might be the point that member states might also rethink their position.
Thank you. Jakub?
As far as judiciary goes, I agree with most of what Basia said, and I'd like just to point out two additional things. First is, as we mentioned earlier, the president plays a role in appointing the judges, but also in appointing people to top positions within the state. And as currently as the judiciary goes, the first president of the Supreme Court has been appointed already by President Duda, so that's kind of ship sailed. But during the term of the next term of the Polish president, in 2022, the term of the president of the Supreme Administrative Court will run out, and this means that there will be a top court to whose president is to be appointed, and the president of Poland will play a role in that. So that's one thing to watch out for coming up in 2022 if nothing changes along the way. And the second thing is, as we mentioned earlier, the president appoints judges. And actually, there's been a long-going controversy on the president roles in appointing judges, because both President Kaczynski and President Duda have, on occasions, refused to appoint new people to the judiciary profession. And those people would try to seek justice before the courts and try to have a ruling on whether the president is obliged to sign these documents and to appoint them to those positions, or whether the president is actually exercising some kind of power, discretionary power, and may simply flat out to refuse to appoint a person. It's been an ongoing controversy, and insofar courts have ruled in favor of Polish president, saying that this is actually the discretionary power to refuse to appoint someone as a judge, which also means that in turn, where for example, Mr. Trzaskowski become the president, he would have the power to control the flow of new people into the judiciary. And given that the ruling party is seen as having altered the National Council of Judiciary in order to be able to grab control over who is becoming a judge in Poland and be able to reshape the judiciary, this might play a very important role where the president to exercise his competence not to appoint those people. So these are the two things to watch out domestically. Internationally, I do agree with Barbara, but also I would like to point out that we have coming up soon some developments on the rule of law on the EU side. September we'll see the rule of law country reports published by the Commission. The rule of law mechanism, the discussion on how to shape this mechanism is ongoing. Just a few days ago, the LIBE Committee of the European Parliament published a draft report on what they perceive as necessary to be introduced in this mechanism. So this discussion is ongoing. And yes, there is also the question of the rule of law conditionality coming up in the next multi-annual budgetary framework of the European Union, but also in the context of the recovery package, the New Europe Fund, which is supposed to be used to recover European Union's economies from the coronavirus, and Poland is set, at least at this point, to be a large beneficiary of this fund, which paves way the question to whether a rule of law conditionality should be applied to this fund and how it should play out. And this is going to all develop in the coming weeks. So watch this space, as we will try to cover this as well and bring you some information on how does this particular angle play out. Thanks.
Great, thank you both. We got our first questions from the audience. Two questions that are going on a more on a similar topic. So did the COVID-19, or how did the COVID-19 pandemic influence the political climate, the campaign, and the rule of law? I know that there's been a lot of issues with the initially planned elections in May that simply did not happen. It's hard for me to define exactly what happened because it was basically a non-event where the elections were simply not held. But in addition to that direct influence on the course of the presidential elections, how did the pandemic affect the political climate, and how did it affect the rule of law? Who wants to go first?
I think I can start a little bit. And I think those two questions really link the topic between the rule of law and the role of the president, except the fact that in the very end, the first round of election did not take place on 10th of May. There was a set of legal amendments into electoral law in Poland, which were adopted again very quickly, and they were after all signed by the president, which made the situation that the law was really unstable just a couple of weeks before the election, which is contrary to the Polish constitution and the Polish case on the tribunal of the constitutional tribunal. So you can see that first of all, you didn't know until the very last moment what will take place when it comes to the how the voting is going to look like. So there was a really high level of legal uncertainty in Poland, which affected directly the political campaign, because this campaign just didn't take place. You wouldn't see any kind of rallies and meetings with the voters, especially by the opposition candidates, because everything was in fact just locked down. Even President Duda, he was not very often I think visible on media or on his rallies because of the whole situation. So it affected it directly on just those two levels, so legal one and also the factual one, that the campaign just did not take place.
I would add to that also the fact that COVID-19 did pose particular challenges for the Polish elections. In Polish electoral system, the idea is that the Poles should have as broad accessibility to voting as possible. And as part of this, Poland extensively allows its citizens abroad to vote. It usually has been conducted by means of voting in person through polling stations set up in Polish embassies and consular agencies, but also in other spots around the world, especially where a lot of Poles are present. Now, of course, this is in particular challenging to pull out during a global pandemic. And the solution was found by allowing vote by mail, which has been, insofar before, not really much used in the Polish electoral system. And countries around the world and Polish diplomacy around the globe tried to work out solutions for that and to ensure that Poles will be able to send the packages with their votes and have those packages received and counted. And insofar, the best way to describe it, that this has been a major mess. There have been reports of people not receiving these packages. There have been reports of people receiving incomplete packages. Polish diplomacy around the world has handled this situation very unevenly. There have been countries where Polish embassies stood up to the task and managed to quickly negotiate with the host country for cooperation with their postal service and for speedy delivery of packages. And there have been countries where this has been a very bumpy road. And there are actually valid concerns about a disenfranchisement of Polish voters abroad who've been, in many cases, effectively denied the opportunity to vote, or have been placed in very challenging situations, having to pull out extraordinary stops, including, for example, sending packages with their votes by expensive courier services to the Polish embassy or consular agency in order to have their vote counted. Now, the background of this is that majority of Polish voters abroad support the opposition candidates, with the exception of the United States and the Polish diaspora there, which is a special case where the ruling party and President Duda enjoys majority of support. Around the globe, for the most part, Poles have been supporting the opposition, which paves way open to questions about whether this setup was not deliberate or whether the setup has been not addressed properly on the count of the fact that most of those votes would go to opposition candidates. Now, what will happen after the second round of the elections is that the Polish Supreme Court will decide whether those elections were valid. It is the competence of the Supreme Court. It is currently vested with one of the new chambers of the Supreme Court established by the ruling party. And questions arise, what will happen when people will start protesting those elections and saying that they've been denied their opportunity to vote, that this situation has been widespread, and that has opened ways to a question whether those elections were valid. Now, we know that in most cases, irregularities in elections happen. In most cases, they are quite small. But we've seen in 2016 the Austrian presidential election cancelled by the court there on the count of irregularities. So I think it is quite important after the election day and after the exit polls and after the official results to watch closely this space on what will happen with the electoral protests and what will be the decision of the Supreme Court, depending on what will be the scale of those irregularities. So that means.
Thank you. You started addressing part of our next question, which was about whether or not there are fears of voter irregularities. So beyond what you've already discussed, Jakub, would you like to expand a bit more on the topic?
Yes, thank you. So if I were to assess the situation, I do not believe that there is a major risk of electoral fraud happening in Poland. What we've seen consistently from the ruling party is that they've been always trying to attach at least a veneer of legality to their actions, and adjustments were always made following a bill passed by the parliament, no matter how contrived the procedure were. There were no outright cases of law being circumvented or illegal action being taken on a large scale. And I would probably say that voter fraud and tampering with the election result could be, if done, would be a breaking point and would probably not be attempted by the ruling party. So I don't think there is a major danger of that. However, I do believe that those irregularities I mentioned earlier could arise from a political motive, given the landscape of Poles voting, and could pave a way for a solid argument on those elections not being valid, depending on their scale. And then the question comes, what will the Supreme Court's chamber that was established by the ruling party and that is controversial in its setup and its functioning will do faced with that? So just to reiterate, the story will not be over this Sunday, and given the close exit polls will probably maybe not even give us the complete picture. But even after we get the official count of the votes from the Electoral Commission, there will be a moment where we will see where the story will go forward. Barbara, what do you think?
I fully agree. I think that you can probably, the main point of problems is in fact those irregularities that you mentioned, the fact that the packages didn't reach the voters on really high scale, I think. So it will be also interesting to look how the Law and Justice Party, how they're gonna react in a situation when those irregularities will be expressed as a voting protests, whereas, for instance, their candidate, so President Duda, if he loses election, so we will see how they're gonna if they're going to support those protests, and they say yes, the voting process was such a mess that it should be I don't reopen, and the campaign should take place once again. So we will see. I think this will be a very interesting point. And as Jakub mentioned, it's also interesting to see how the Supreme Court and this extraordinary chamber, I mean the Chamber of Extraordinary Control and Public Affairs, how those new judges, how they're going to look into those protests, depending also what kind of arguments and what scale of those protests will be. So I think this will be two interesting points to see.
Thank you both. We have another question with regards to the elections themselves. So following up on the COVID-19 emergency measures, what is the role of the Poland's National Electoral Commission in this particular election? Who wants to go first?
I mean, I can start, but just giving a brief comparison between what is happening right now and what was happening before the May of 10. Right now, the National Election Commission, they organized what the commission before May the 10th was the fact that they were deprived of many of their powers, and they were given to one of the ministers who was supervising the procedure of preparing the voting, the postal voting. So all those voting packages were prepared by one of the ministers. His name is Sasin. And the main problem, also it was a rule of law problem, that there was no legal basis for him to organize those postal voting, because the law was still, it hasn't been adopted yet. It was still being discussed in Senate. So right now, I think we can say that most of the competences are back to the Electoral Commission. However, the fact that so many changes took place just before the election, I think it really undermines sort of trust to the Commission, but also to the whole election procedure, which is really, I think, it's really important to look when we see also how the situation on the rule of law and legal certainty in Poland it looks right now.
I would add to that insofar the National Electoral Commission, which is National Electoral Commission, which is headed by Mr. Sylwester Marciniak, a judge of the Supreme Administrative Court, has been altered, but not to the point of becoming controversial and not to the point raising any doubts whether this is an independent body. The National Electoral Commission is tasked with the technical aspects of carrying out the vote and the whole organizing the entire voting procedure. The OSCE's assessment of the first round of the Polish presidential election did not find any controversies regarding how the National Electoral Commission did proceed with its tasks. However, once again, coming back to what we said earlier, why the National Electoral Commission is in principle tasked with carrying out technically the elections. In this particular election, a lot of the work has been carried out by the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs with organizing the vote abroad, for example, and it has been the major actor in handling that jointly with all the Polish embassies and consular agencies against the world. So it is a little bit different election from the regular Polish elections when the National Electoral Commission is the sole body tasked with the technical aspects. I do not think that there is any danger and risk of the National Electoral Commission not fulfilling its mandate in an independent way. It has insofar carried out its tasks professionally and in a way that would not pave way to any controversies. But once again, it's 2020 and we can't be sure of anything. So we will also watch this space to see what actions will the National Electoral Commission take following the vote, especially with the two very possible flashpoints. First being a very close call which is quite likely. The polls are alternating between giving a slight lead to one candidate or the other. It can go both ways, and it can be a really, really close call this year. That's one thing. And the second, once again, the irregularities with voting abroad, which also will be probably part of the discussion immediately following the election. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving away from Warsaw and towards Brussels a bit. Right now, with the multi-year budget negotiations underway, with the COVID response fund being negotiated as well, there's a lot of talk of the idea of conditionality being built in so that countries that break or backslide on the rule of law in the EU do not get funds. So we'd like to get your opinion on, one, the likelihood of this kind of measure being introduced, and two, whether you think it would be effective in stopping the backslide of the rule of law in Poland. Jakub, I'll let you go first.
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, when we're talking about the conditionality currently, we need to look at two separate topics. One is the multi-annual financial framework of the European Union, the big 7-year budget, which is now underway being discussed, and there are talks about attaching rule of law conditionality to it. And the second is the coronavirus emergency package. And one interesting aspect of the coronavirus emergency package and conditionalities and the rule of law is that just yesterday, the European Commission published its financial forecasts for the European Union. The financial forecast in general is grim, with the expected contraction of the economies in most EU member states going even further than initially assumed. But Poland is, well, maybe not the green island this time, but maybe the least yellow island. And it is said to have the smallest negative impact on its economy as a result of coronavirus, with just minus 4.6% shrinking of the economy, which is of course still a huge number, but not as big as, say, Italy, Spain, Croatia, or several other countries. And at the same time, there is discussion of Poland receiving a rather large sum as part of the coronavirus recovery package. There is talk of a triple-digit number. Prime Minister Morawiecki did boast that Poland is set to receive 157 billion euro of coronavirus recovery, which is probably not exactly going to happen, given that the budget entire package is 500 billion. But still, Poland is set to receive quite a large number, and a discussion is emerging: whether Poland, given the fact that its economy is set to be impacted to the least degree, should receive that much money. But the second is whether in the situation, especially given the funds, rule of law conditionality should not be attached. And we're monitoring the discussions happening behind the scenes, and we will be soon providing you with a scoop on that as more details emerge. As far as attaching the conditionality, well, ultimately, I believe it comes down to the fact that it would have to be agreed upon by all the member states. And it's not just the Poland in this mix. There is Hungary, which is also a contentious spot when it comes to the rule of law backsliding. But there are also other member states which might be not that thrilled about the rule of law conditionality being attached to either budget. That might include, for example, countries like Romania and Bulgaria. So currently we're in the backroom discussion and deals phase of setting those budgets. And we are looking forward to seeing any concrete proposal from the Commission on this. But unfortunately, I would say I am not that much enthusiastic about the direction this has been going in so far, although I am open to being positively surprised by the Commission, and then even more positively surprised by the member states agreeing on that. But there will be a lot of detail to be monitored and to be seen as to whether those mechanisms, even if they are introduced, will be able to effectively address the situation. Because we've seen many times in the past various conditionality and assessment mechanisms being introduced by a lot of international bodies, and those mechanisms ultimately, despite being introduced, getting watered down to the point of being non-effective, or to the point where discussion on the rule of law ends up with the conclusion that there are issues with the rule of law everywhere, so we can't really stop the flow of money to all EU member states, and let's just call it a done deal. We've gone through the process, but the process was in fact not really addressing the issue at hand. So there's quite a lot of to watch in this space in the very coming weeks as we head for our holidays and the European Union heads to discussions on the budget. Barbara, what do you think?
I mean, I fully agree that the question of whether conditionality is an effective tool to ensure rule of law among member states is an open question. When you look at the accession procedure and accession process, actually Poland was reviewed under one of the conditionality elements was rule of law, independence of judiciary, and we passed this exam in 2004. Apparently, it was not such a strong element that it could not be watered down or destroyed after 15 years. So right now we are facing a completely different situation, and this conditionality mechanism at the level of accession apparently was not effective enough. What might be interesting is to look how the procedure will look in detail. So who is going to make a decision and under what conditions? The initial procedure proposed by the Commission says that decision is going to be taken by the reversed qualified majority, which basically means that unless there is a majority of member states opposing the idea to freeze EU funds, then the decision is going to be taken and approved by the Council after a proposal given by the Commission. So unless this provision is not will not change, we will see how effective this mechanism will be, because I think we cannot end up with something similar to Article 7 procedure, something that is going to take place forever without any final decision being taken. But I also fully understand that situation when member states with authoritarian government is going to, for instance, organize anti-EU law campaign using EU funds is a situation that the EU cannot allow for.
Thank you both. Jakub, I'll have a follow-up to this actually, but first I'd like to just let our audience know we still have about 10 minutes left in our discussion today. So please, if you have any questions, now is the time to send them to us. Following up on this, seeing the political deadlock in the EU, at the EU level right now when it comes to this, what could other member states do to push back on rule of law backsliding? Jakub.
So from what we've managed to gauge, there is a strong group of around 10 EU member states, including France and Germany, who are strongly supportive of the idea of the rule of law conditionality being attached. And we also know that the Friends of the Rule of Law group, which includes Netherlands and the Scandinavian countries, has also been very strongly advocating for this. And there is a movement among the member states at the very least. Also, one thing important to consider is that everything is a part of the greater picture when it comes to the European Union. And the kind of a background of a discussion of the rule of law and the budget conditionalities attached to that. There is also the discussion on the climate change and the green economy, and just coincidentally, Poland's been the only country not exactly signing up for the climate goals of the European Union and the environmental packaging so far. So that might figure out into the back and forth on this as well. So it's all connected, and it's all coming down in July and August as the EU discusses the budget. But I thought personally, what I believe is important is for those countries, for the member states that are in support of the rule of law conditionality, to be supportive of this not only behind closed doors during EU negotiations, but also openly, and to bring forward the diplomacy and to highlight that this is crucial and this is not just a position of individuals within the government, but this represents a broader sentiment in the member states that you cannot receive the funds unless you meet those standards. and you cannot receive emergency recovery to support your economy if you at the same time don't get some of the things in your country in order. I think this sentiment in particular might also find a broader appeal among other member states, because as we know, apart from the rule of law discussion, then there is those more frugal members of the EU pushing for reforms in member states, broader reforms, economic reforms also, as a condition for receiving support, which also means that it also could be connected and could be formed in a bigger package. If you want to receive the money from the EU, clean up your house, not just as far as economy goes, not just as far as the rule of law goes, not just as far as climate goes, it's all interconnected. But this requires quite considerable political investment, and I'm very curious to see what will happen in the coming weeks when those discussions will become more public and we will be able to see who is going to push strongly and who is going to put their strength of their position within the EU on the line. Let's hope that those critical mass of EU member states in favor of those solutions will become more vocal, and we will see them play out in the Commission, the Council, in the coming weeks.
Well, I think there are at least three types of actions that member states can take. The first one is something we see quite often, is a sort of soft statements taken by member states, usually group of member states, expressing their concerns or how they see the EU working in the field of the rule of law. The second aspect is, in fact, the Council. So how the member states build coalitions and how they work on Article 7 procedure. I don't think that there is any follow-up right now. I mean, some new developments regarding the situation in this procedure. I think member states just presented their position and they keep it. The third thing is something which I already mentioned. So member states can decide to sue other member states to the Court of Justice, arguing that the other member states, maybe member state is violates rule of law. And I think it's really important thing to remember. I know it's from the diplomatic point of view, it's really risky to go there, but I think if you say that rule of law is really important for us, you cannot just wait until Council making that decision. I think this is the moment to show this courage. The last thing about actions that are possible and available to member states is something connected with those soft statements. But I think we already saw it in Poland when the mother law was being adopted. The government used to argue that this is something which is based on French law, and the same provisions exist in France. I think this is the moment when the French government should take very direct actions and provide detailed information why drafted Polish law is not even similar to the French solutions.
Thank you both. And now our last question for the day. Are there any lessons learned that countries that are consolidating their democracies, young democracies, that they can learn from the Polish experience?
I would say there's been a lot of talk about how the situation in Poland could have played out if the Polish constitutional framework would be stronger in the way of protecting itself from potential takeovers and backsliding. But ultimately, it all comes down to people. It comes down to the political goodwill of people who are in the government and who are in the parliament, who are actually taking actions. But it also comes down to what is important for the people on the ground. And I think that an interesting comparison has to be drawn here between Poland and Slovakia. The latest parliamentary elections in Slovakia have been very heavily influenced by the topic of the rule of law, which has become a burning issue in the country following the murder of the journalist Jan Kmieciak and the cover-up of that murder and an exposure of a massive scale of corruption and cronyism within the government, judiciary, and the parliament all taken together. And this topic has had a massive influence on the elections in Slovakia because the people were invested in this topic and the people held this as important, and the rule of law became one of the most important elements of decision-making by voters at the polls. Now, in Poland, I believe the issue comes from the fact that the rule of law backsliding, the constitution and the values are important for a part of the society, but are of a secondary, if not tertiary consideration for another part of the society. And the problem is, I believe, the same as it usually is that some people don't realize the importance of certain issues until the very last moment when those issues touch upon them. And this is something what you can't really fix in other way than through information, education, and through making sure that, let's say, the discourse is not only about the economy, it's not only about the money, it's not only about the social support packages and what do you get from the government in your pocket, but it's also about the importance of certain values and the importance of safeguarding the rule of law, democracy, and human rights, because at some point in the future, those issues may affect you. And I think we've seen a very, let's say, optimistic show of how the importance of those topics played out in Slovakia, and we are seeing slowly the importance of those rising in Poland. But all this shows that this is just critical for those topics for people to be educated on, for the civil society, for the international cooperation, for the stakeholders involved to work towards making sure that you know what the rule of law does for you and what it could do, even if at this very point in your life, the independence of the judiciary, the quality of law and the related topics are not that critical today, they might be critical tomorrow. That would be my take on what the emerging democracies can learn from that.
I think two issues are extremely important, and I think they're going to be in connection to what Jakub has already said. The first thing is education. We need to be educated why constitution, why rule of law is important, and when, in fact, you can see that the rule of law is being implemented. I think this lesson has not been learned by Poland so far. We are learning it right now, so a little bit too late. And the second point is accountability. If there is any chance by politicians to ensure that the highest officials are going to be found accountable for what their misconduct, I think you have to guarantee that this will be ensured. I think in my opinion, if the ruling party and its leader knew that he cannot violate constitution, he cannot swear into office judges unlawfully appointed to the Constitutional Tribunal, they wouldn't do that because they would know, they would see before that such situation ended up with being removed from the office, for instance. But I think this is also the second thing that in Poland has not been really in fact established, and this is something that is closely linked with political and legal culture that also needs to be reinforced when you have those two elements, when you have education guaranteed and also accountability. Then you can say that we have a really strong legal culture.
Thank you for that. So on that note, I'd like to thank you, Barbara Grabowska-Moroz and Jakub Jaraczewski, for your time today, and to all of you in the audience for spending your morning with us if you're in the same time zone as us. If you want to learn more about rule of law developments in Poland, Democracy Reporting International published just yesterday a report that gives you an overview of the major rule of law issues in the country. You can find it at democracy-reporting.org. I'll thank you all for your time and wish everyone a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.